Okay, let me open the chat. Yes, so everything seems to be working. So hello to everyone. This is, I don't even know the date. It's November 5th, 17 and 65. So time to travel back in time. If you have a little TARDIS, the way Mr. and Mrs. Q do, you can hop in and travel back to New York City at the beginning of November 1765, where some incredible events have been occurring. Um, Needless to say, New York is quite agitated since the implementation of the odious Stamp Act 4 days ago on the 1st of November. And the Stamp Act, as you probably know, is a tax on our use of paper here in the colonies. Now, the tax was passed back in March earlier this year, and since it was passed, all types of mayhem have erupted in the city of New York, coming to a head recently with the actual supposed implementation of the tax. So what is the big deal about the stamp tax? I'm going to sit a little closer, hold on, there, and get up on my pillow. There we go, much better. So let's look at a few things about the stamp tax. And I'm going to switch my picture to our first one. Give me a moment. And I think there it is. The infamous Stamp Act of 1765, passed by the Parliament, signed into law by George III, a tax on us using paper here in the colonies. A tax on all the paper, so whatever you're using your paper for, if you're writing a letter to one of your lady friends, that paper must be taxed. If you need a license or a diploma or any business documents, those are all taxed. All legal documents are taxed. Ship manifests are taxed. Bills of lading, customs documents, printed materials, almanacs, pamphlets, newspapers, you all get the idea. So all of this paper is going to be taxed, and the money sent back to England into the Treasury, they say, to pay for our defense here in the colonies, which is kind of a sticky little issue in its own, because we're not really sure why England needs to have an occupying army here, since the war with France and the Indians has been over for quite some time. So we're really a little puzzled over why we need to pay for an occupying army. So the stamp tax is the tax on paper, and trust me, there was plenty of opposition to the stamp tax, not only here, but in England as well. Many people in the Parliament didn't think it was such a very good idea, and we believe this to be one of Parliament's really dumbest things they have done to us yet. Because when you think about it, the stamp tax is now affecting everybody in the colonies. Normally we in New York are bickering with Boston, and we're bickering with Philadelphia, and we're bickering with the South, and we're all arguing over who has the best exports, who has the best city, whose currency is better to deal in, where our borders are, and whatever you can think of, we are probably arguing and bickering over it. And prior to the stamp tax, whenever England tried to tax us, it usually only affected a couple colonies here and there. But the Stamp Act now affects us all. And it's an internal tax. So it's not a tax on us trading things between each other and England or trading with the outside world. It is an actual tax on the people of the colonies to be sent back to England. And by the way, it creates a whole big bureaucracy to manage that tax too, which I won't bother to get into here. So that's the gist of the stamp tax. So immediately we were upset about it. But cleverly, some of us sat down and we read the stamp tax, and we found this interesting little passage that I think I have for you right here. We have this interesting little passage, and you notice I underlined it there, something about a sinking fund. And what this says, I think it's page 35 of the Stamp Act, says that any money left over from the administration of the Stamp Act or the use of the military goes into Parliament's sinking fund. So here we go. We have the sinking fund, the fund commonly called the sinking fund. Such said monies can be used for any expenses the Parliament sees fit to use them for. So doesn't that make it a revenue tax? Now it becomes a revenue tax, a tax on us for the Parliament to spend any way they would like to spend it. And yes, someone says it's a slush fund. Exactly. For them to pay off their little debts and clever little things and maybe pay off a few people of the East India Company if they need to. We'll talk about that another time when we talk about the Tea Act. Let me see. Did England tax the colonists for the amount of sunlight coming into their homes? Yes, England taxed the Irish based on the size and number of windows in their bare bones cottages. Yes, luckily we did not get the sunlight tax, but they did do this in other places, which is why in some of the old homes from the 18th century, you see little teeny weeny windows, because they taxed by the number of and size of windows. We luckily, as you can see behind me, escaped that tax, as we have very big windows in our homes here in New York. I guarantee they will get much smaller if they try to tax the windows. That is, if they manage to even implement that tax. So we say it's a revenue tax. And as a revenue tax, we can only be taxed by our own representatives. So that would be our colonial legislatures. So the people we elect to our New York Assembly can tax us for revenue, which they do because someone has to pay for the building of ports and the administration of the ports and things like that. Roads, parks, all of the things you would imagine a government needs to pay for. So we know what revenue taxes are because we do pay them here ourselves, but we pay them to the assemblies that we elect directly, and we elect no one to the Parliament. And someone very clever explained this to the Parliament, and his name was Benjamin Franklin, the colonial agent from Philadelphia, who explained to the Parliament that this was a really bad idea, that first of all, we would see through it as a revenue tax. We would object to it on that account. And even worse, it would do what no one else had been able to do yet in the colonies: unite everyone against the crown. Unite not only the merchants and the lawyers and the landowners and the dock workers and the artisans who would all pay the tax. Unite all of us regardless of class. And that one of the powers the Parliament and the Crown did have to keep us under control over here was to keep us arguing with each other, right? To keep us all against each other, turn the merchant class against the landed gentry, against the laborers, against the farmers, against the printers, Massachusetts against New York, against Pennsylvania, against Virginia, that was a source of great power that the Parliament possessed, keeping us at each other, but giving us an opportunity to unite. We would begin to see our power when united. And the story has it that Mr. Franklin was at a meeting with some members of Parliament when he explained this to them, and they thought it was so ridiculous that we would unite that they laughed him out of the room. So perhaps they should have listened to such a smart gentleman who understood the colonies. Mr. Franklin also understood, give me just a moment here, also understood that there were gentlemen and ladies here in the colonies who were trying to unite us for some time and were unsuccessful because of our petty differences and arguments, but that this would be handing them an opportunity. So we began to unite, and people of the colony started to communicate with each other. And before you know it, this is how the stamp tax was represented. And this is the masthead from the Pennsylvania Journal and Weekly Advertiser. You can see up on the top a skull and crossbones, another little skull over there. And look at the masthead, the Pennsylvania Journal and Weekly Advertiser. Oh, this is the cute cat. Here's Petey the cat making a little cameo appearance tonight. But look at what it says: expiring in hopes of a resurrection to life again. Is that such a great title? Expiring in hopes of a resurrection to life again. So in other words, the tax will kill us. So we started representing the tax. Oh, and up in the upper corner, the times are, what does it say? despicable, something doleful, disastrous, and dolorous. So all these terrible words about what's going on here. So you see it represented like this, and the little skull and crossbones you see represented on publications everywhere for the stamp tax. Now, one of the problems for England is that the tax did pass in March, but wasn't to be implemented until November 1st, giving us lots of time to join up and complain. And so we joined up. And we started saying no taxation without representation. No taxation without representation. A wonderful motto, don't you think? No taxation without representation. Would we get representation? Probably not. Did we want it? Probably not, as we would be outvoted. So a wonderful slogan, no taxation without representation. And before you knew it, protests were breaking out up and down the East Coast in the major cities and towns. So now we have everyone saying the same slogans, having the same protests, and really the Crown and the Parliament and the governors really not knowing what to do with us. I want to share another picture with you here. I didn't want to do that. What I did want to do was this, because I like this. This is one of my favorites. there's the effect of the stamp. Oh, the fatal stamp. So we see this everywhere. So now everyone is protesting throughout the summer. The governors need someone to collect on the stamped paper. In other words, to make sure it's distributed and properly used, and then to collect the money. And those gentlemen are called stamp agents. So in Boston, the Sons of Liberty grabbed the stamp agent, dragged him from his house through the streets of Boston, and brutally beat him. When words of that event reached New York, our stamp agent, Mr. James McEvers, who lived not far from here at the corner of Wall and Smith Streets, or for you today, Wall and William Streets, Mr. McEvers headed down to Fort George, found Governor Colden, and resigned as the stamp agent. And he offered the governor some excellent advice. He said, when the stamps arrive in this port, do not bring them into the town. Lock them in the fort. Keep them here. It is too dangerous. And he made his way home. And when he got home, 90 gentlemen were there waiting for him. And when he saw them, he quickly announced, I resigned my position as the stamp agent, and you are free to visit Governor Colden and view the resignation for yourselves. And in joy, they picked him up and gave him 3 huzzas in celebration. So James McEvers became a great hero here, resigning as the stamp agent and being the first stamp agent in the colonies to do so. Every stamp agent followed his example, except Mr. Zacharias Hood of Baltimore, Maryland, who came to New York to hide out. But no one in New York would give him a room in their home or their inn, and he wound up living in Fort George for a time until the Sons of Liberty broke into Fort George, located Mr. Hood, and forced him to resign as the stamp agent, thus leaving no stamp agents to receive the stamped paper. Truly, no one was foolish enough to accept that position after that happened. So the summer went by and the fall went by, and then November 1st approached, the first day of the Stamp Act. But since no stamped paper was brought into New York, I think this is it. Here it is. Nope, that's not it. Give me a minute. Oh, do I not have it here? I may not have it here. I know I made it. Give me just a moment to find this image. I'm sure I made it. Here it is. There it is. You notice a handbill from Boston, no stamped paper to be had. In other words, there was no stamped paper anywhere in the colonies. This was published by our brothers and sisters in Boston in celebration to celebrate each other and our firmness in standing against the distribution of the stamped paper. So although the stamped paper may have come in on ships and may have been locked in forts, there was no actual distribution of it anywhere. So a wonderful handbill from Boston: no stamped paper to be had in order to pay or use the stamped paper and pay the tax. Well, the night before the stamp tax, October 31st, while all of you in the 21st century were celebrating Halloween, we in colonial New York City were having a funeral march for the stamp tax. Actually, it was a funeral march in honor of Lady Liberty, who had died of a cruel stamp to her vitals. We met on the Commons dressed in black with candlelight and lanterns. We had an effigy of the governor and a scaffolding, and we had a number of other items that would be a bit arcane for me to explain to you in your time. And in a group, we made our way from the northern end of the town, the Commons. You who've joined me on a tour, that's where we met for our tour. And we walked almost straight down the hill of the Broadway to the Battery and Fort George. Making a detour, we made a left on Wall Street, went to the stamp agent James McEver's home, gave him 3 huzzas again, went back up to the Broadway, and made our way down to Fort George. Captain John Montresor recorded in his journal, he said that it was such an imposing sight, seeing the lights appearing in the dark, making their way down the hill of the Broadway to Fort George. When the funeral march, got to Fort George, the gentlemen attempted to tear down the wooden wall around the fort because the commander of the fort, Major James, a few weeks before had stated that if we were unwilling to accept the stamp paper, he would have them shoved down our throats. Imagine what a savage! Because, we know the English soldiers and officers, they might appear to be gentlemen, but they are truly savages. We all know that, which is why we're going to, in a short time, oppose the Quartering Act. So those of you who are going to join Karen Q next Tuesday will learn all about the Quartering Act. So we know they're savages. Anyway, we get down there. The gentlemen attempted to pull down the wooden fence around Fort George and were unsuccessful in their rage at Major James. And looking down from them, from the fence, were the British soldiers themselves pointing their bayonets down at the protesters. And frustrated with that, the gentlemen then went nearby to the stable of Governor Colden, where they removed his chariot. He has a number of carriages, but he enjoys riding around the city in this ridiculous chariot. Took his chariot, brought it to the Bowling Green. I almost forgot. There's the Stamp Act riot. There's the Stamp Act protest, and you can see up there, I'm so difficult at this, you can see up there the sign, the little effigy of the governor there, and various other effigies. So this was the protest that made its way down the Broadway to Fort George. And I do also have Fort George here for you. And there's lovely Fort George. I'll move out of the way. You can see a very nice neighborhood around Fort George and the Bowling Green. So this is the Bowling Green Park. And took the carriage, the chariot was taken from Colden Stable, brought here to the Bowling Green, where it was burned. And the effigy of the governor hanged. And everyone cheered and had a wonderful time. This apparently went on until 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. I had long departed by then. The group made their way up to the Greenwich Road and Warren Street, the home of Major James, where they ravaged his home, threw his belongings out of the windows, threatened and terrified his staff, and then rang all the church bells in the town. I am not sure of the significance of that action, and everyone went home. And that was that. Well, I only saw a part of this march because through most of it, the Burns Coffee House or Tavern, or also known as the City Tavern, with the rest of the merchants of the town. The merchants called a meeting that night at the Burns Tavern, and the protest went right by us on the Broadway, at the Burns Tavern, to discuss something called a non-importation, non-exportation agreement, which I think in your time would simply be called a boycott. You have found much more facility with shortening your language in your time. So a non-importation, non-exportation agreement to us, meaning that we merchants decided we would not import any goods from England, nor would we send them any raw materials. Very serious thing for England, because you see, by this time, we started to figure out our leverage over England, and we began discussing it with each other. If England needs our raw materials for their factories, and then England must sell those goods back to us in order to fuel employment in England, what if they can't do it? Just how big a market is the colonies for England? Is it a major market? Is it a market large enough to cripple their economy? Well, we set about to find out, and we did. Incredibly, all the merchants in New York gathered at the Burns Tavern. I can't even tell you how agitating it was to have all of us together because, as you could imagine, just as the colonies never agree with each other, merchants in New York never agree with each other either. And we can sit in the same room and argue for hours over minutia because for some reason, I just think it's in the DNA of everyone born in this colony, especially on this island. But miraculously, the meeting was a success, and every merchant in our city agreed to accept no shipments from England and to stop those that were en route and to send no materials to England. Now, stopping those materials, those goods that were en route, of course, would be a financial burden for us as we had already had to at least pay for them. Not as much as we would make selling them, of course, because we buy things at cost and then sell them at a retail price. But there would be some loss for all of us in agreeing to do this. So I just want to be sure you understand that this was a financial hardship for all of us merchants that we did incredibly agree to shoulder. And we agreed to this in New York. And even more stunning, it was agreed to from Maine to Georgia. All of the merchants of the colonies joined together and stopped trade with England. So here we are today on day 4 of that agreement. And we hope that this will send a loud, clear message to England of just how powerful we are here in the colonies, because we believe amongst ourselves that united, we are far more powerful than we have realized in the past, and far more powerful than our English brothers and sisters give us credit for. And that this non-importation, non-exportation agreement will fully demonstrate that to England, that we are no longer people to be trifled with, and no longer people to be treated as children or slaves, but that we now have established ourselves as a trading powerhouse, and that they will now see just how much they need us. And we will see where our boycott goes from here, or our non-importation agreement goes from here. Now, I am hoping personally that all of the merchants will stand strong throughout this, as it will become an even bigger burden as the months go by. Mr. Q and I are determined to see this through, as are our good friends, William Alexander, the Earl of Stirling, and his mother, Mrs. Alexander, as well as our good friend, Captain Alexander McDougall, and many other merchants in the town. We have agreed to stand strong through this time. Also, we will not wear any imported clothing during this time. All clothing will be homespun and made from local linens. So no more of my pretty imported linen dresses, cotton dresses. I will be having some dresses made of the local cottons and linens, and for winter, the local wools, to show our solidarity. I would not want to be someone found walking the streets in a month or so in any imported clothing or textiles at that time, as I believe things may go badly for them. So let's see, do we have any questions? I think that New York was indeed first with the non-importation, non-exportation agreement. And even if we weren't first, we were first. I think, I think you probably understand that. Even if we weren't first, we were first. Do we have any? So do you guys have any questions? Just go ahead and ask me in the chat, or unmute yourself, or over on Facebook. Feel free to ask me any questions you have about this whole stamp tax thing. This is one of the most important things that happened in our nation's history, the Stamp Act, and the fact that the colonies got over our, at least for now, petty differences to unite against the crown. It was completely unexpected on the side of England, and when it happened, they were shocked. Yes, sir, my friend from Setauket reminds me that gaming pieces such as dice were also taxed and stamped with the GR for Georgius Rex, King George. The packages they came in were stamped as well, and the packages of playing cards were stamped, and the dice were stamped, the dice packages. Everything had the Georgius Rex stamp on it. And let's see. Thank you, Mr. Reed, for liking my dress. This dress is modern American cotton, so maybe I can get away with still wearing it. Since it really is American cotton, I might be able to get away with still wearing it. How long did the boycott last? The boycott lasted until the repeal of the Stamp Act, which came in March 1766, almost 1 year to the day that it was passed. It was very successful, and so that would be only 4 months, I think. November, December, January, February. 4.5 months it lasted. By February, Prime Minister Rockingham started arguing against the stamp tax. He was a Whig, a very good friend and ally of Mr. Pitt, who, by the way, Mr. Pitt came to New York and he met with all of the merchants in New York. It was very pleasant to meet with Mr. Pitt and his friend, Mr. Smith, Adam Smith, who visited Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, met with all of the merchants of our towns, and asked us what we would do if the stamp tax was indeed passed. And when we explained that we would not trade, and if it went on long enough, we would simply get into other types of business, and we would become self-sufficient in the colonies instead, manufacturing all we needed for ourselves and using each other as our own market. They were highly impressed, not only at our resolve, but our understanding of economics. Because you see, in London, the members of Parliament, members of the House of Lords and the Commons, they all think they're so much smarter than we are. They think they have such a better knowledge of economics and manufacturing than do we. But we run our own businesses. We have a very thin margin of success here. We are very good at what we do, and we do indeed understand markets. We don't always make the best decisions concerning them, but we understand them. Mr. Pitt and Mr. Smith were highly impressed at the understanding of markets and economic leverage that we had here in the colonies, and went back and explained that not only did we have the knowledge, that together we could be our own market for all of our goods, and that we had the resolve to achieve that. He warned the Parliament that the stamp tax and our refusal to obey it could be devastating for England. which it turned out to be. And this gave us, of course, our first look at a united colonies and what a united colonies could achieve in the future. It gave us a foundation for what would come later in the year 1776 in the Philadelphia Continental Congress. So the beginnings of that, those seeds are sowed with the stamp tax, ironically planted by England herself in her foolishness in the way she has dealt with us. A great irony, I think. Why did the colonies not have their own industrial base for processing their own materials? Well, just as you were in Ireland, Mr. McHugh, we were forbidden to do so. We were forbidden by the Navigation Acts to manufacture our own goods. We were a perfect market for England. England exploited her colonies everywhere, and the exploitation here in America was the cheap acquisition of raw materials and a captive market for the items made with those raw materials. Mercantilism. The Navigation Acts controlled all of that. We here in New York received shipments in April and November of all the goods coming from England. And at that time, the city is packed with people from all over the New York area who come in to buy the goods that they are only allowed to buy from England. And those goods come in at that time. So we are a captive market, not by will, but by force of law, the Navigation Acts. Now, I might add here that Mr. Pitt and Mr. Smith, their solution to the financial crisis in England, which led to the Stamp Act, was to lift the Navigation Acts. Mr. Pitt said, lift the Navigation Acts, allow them to do what they do best, engage in unrestricted free trade everywhere, because through that we will achieve more on customs, even after they cheat, which we know they'll cheat, but even after they cheat, we will acquire more revenue in customs than these regressive Navigation Acts and taxes will ever achieve. And of course, they all thought Mr. Pitt was out of his mind, lost his marbles, and had been infected with some sort of mental illness while here in the colonies. Although I believe Mr. Pitt is way ahead of his time, and he may just be predicting what will come of America in the future. Yes, Mr. Reed asks whether there were black markets. Of course there were black markets, but remember, there were crown officials all over the colonies keeping track of imports, exports, and what we bought and what we sold. So there were crown officials. Now, between us, all of the merchants know that it's quite easy to slip a few things through the customs agent if you maybe provide some gifts to the customs agent. So there is quite a bit of that going on. Also, in places like Rhode Island, where the ship captains are very savvy, very good captains who know every little nook and cranny of their shoreline, it might not be unusual for a merchant to land a ship in one of those little lagoons, remove a portion of the goods, and then bring the ship into port with the rest of the goods. It may not even be unusual that maybe some of those customs documents may have also been fixed in England to reflect the smaller cargo, because it is possible maybe to give a gift to the customs agent on each side. So there definitely are black markets, but there are many crown officials here who are paid very well and who do look out for these types of violations, and we do get fined or jailed for it. So there is some oversight and control. But Mr. Franklin understood that we, if we chose, could, kind of cheat them out of business in England if we so chose. We abided by the Navigation Acts, or I should say we do abide by the Navigation Acts, because we are subjects of the crown, and we do believe and Parliament and the King, and we do believe this is the finest government on earth, and that we in the colonies are beneficiaries of the greatness of the British common law and the greatness of the limited powers of the British monarchy. So until this time, we have very much respected the British Crown and Parliament and do believe that we are beneficiaries of the greatest, freest nation on earth, Britain. So until now, when they have decided to abuse us, we have never questioned our loyalty to them before, but we now do question the way they view us. Do they view us as fellow subjects of the common law, equal to them, or are we just a foreign people to be exploited? And this is a question which will have to be settled with the resolution of the Stamp Act. If the Crown repeals the Stamp Act, I believe we will be joyous and we will be even more loyal and more happy to be subjects of the Crown and Parliament, seeing that they have seen their mistake and have had a willingness to recognize their mistake and to rectify that mistake and to bring us again into the loving arms of England. And this is what we all hope for here in 1765, that our good relationship will be restored and that we will go forward as happy subjects of the Crown. And that resolution, I believe now, is in the Crown and Parliament's hands. It's all up to them as to what happens next. But we have made our stand here. Did the Sons of Liberty have any repercussion for the riot against the Stamp Act? No. The Governor Colden, I think, Governor Colden, I believe, does not want to aggravate them further. I also believe that Governor Colden is a fine and educated man, and he himself sees the flaws of the Stamp Act and the problem, the legal problem with it. Governor Colden himself is a lawyer and a scientist and an astronomer, and likes to think of himself as a Renaissance man, which he is. And I think he also understands our point of view, and that although he may have lost his chariot, no real harm was done with the Sons of Liberty and the men of the town letting off a bit of steam and expressing their displeasure. So I believe that Governor Colden, although he, certainly has been writing about his opposition to the Sons of Liberty and that he believes they are thugs and terrorists and, what does he call them? Dregs and lowlifes. And of course, they're all Scottish and Dutch because they're the worst, And, so I believe Governor Colden, when he calms down, is a measured man in his thinking and does understand the anger, the justifiable anger that the Stamp Act has produced. So there's no repercussions for what happened, at least not to this time. There hasn't been. So no one has gone to jail or anything like that. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of the soldiers laughed about this themselves. What else? So any other questions about this? So I hope everyone enjoyed our little talk about the Stamp Act and Mrs. Q's thoughts about the stamp tax. And I think that in your time, those questions might be relevant as well. What government can tax you for what purposes? So we do believe our own government has the right to tax us for such things, and we don't reject the Crown's right to tax trade within the empire. We do understand the need to raise money for the government to function, but we do not believe that a government we do not elect cannot tax us internally in our colonies. And gee, I wonder if one day we would agree to let a government over all of the colonies tax us directly within each of our colonies. And I bet there would be some disagreement over that in the future. just speculating myself here. Were there any recorded reactions on the part of King George regarding the riots? Honestly, I do not know how much information was reaching the king himself. If I were the king's ministers, a lot of what is happening here in the colonies, I probably would not want to inform the king of. And many of the governors did not send all of the information back to the king. Indeed, many governors were still reporting back to the king, the colonies love you. They still love you. It's just a few lawyers, as usual, making trouble. Oh, those damn lawyers in New York. Don't worry about it. The people still love you. So I doubt the king really had a good understanding of what was happening in the colonies regarding the Stamp Act. I also don't know if the king was taking seriously the opponents of the Stamp Act in the Parliament itself, as they were Whigs, and the king has a personal grudge against the Whigs. So he may not be taking the Whigs seriously either. But if I were a minister, would not want to deliver some of this news to the king. I, especially talking about the future, would not want to be the person who's going to tell the king in 1776 that a Declaration of Independence has been passed and that his statue has been torn down throughout the colonies. So imagine yourself being the person in the ministry who would have to deliver such news to the king. So I doubt they're delivering very much of what's going on in the colonies directly to the king unless it is of the utmost importance. I can see some of you are laughing. I kind of imagine in my mind a group of ministers saying, no, I told him last time. It's your turn to tell him this time. I told him, I told him about the filthy pornographic letter the lawyers in New York sent last week. You tell him about the filthy pornographic letter we got from Boston this week. And who's going to tell him about the horrible thing we got from Philadelphia? So I think I have in my mind, I imagine them all, saying, well, look, it's your turn this time to have to tell him about this event. I'm sure that no one really enjoyed having to inform the king of these things. And again, I'm not sure how much of it actually got to the king, because remember, the king is dealing with big problems in England during this time, one of them being a massive financial crisis. He's also dealing with big issues in India and China because of the East India Company, and he is always dealing with issues with France, Spain, and Holland. So the king has lots of other things to be thinking about. Is the parliament really an equal force against a king? I think a king is all strong like a dictator. Well, an interesting debate on this is Mr. Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, published in 1776. When the British had their glorious revolution and William III, William of Orange, was placed on the crown in my time about 100 years ago, part of the agreement was that the monarchy would be limited by increased powers of the people in the commons, that there would be a greater of balance of power between the commons and the crown. And with this agreement, William of Orange became king, and the British Parliament became a little more powerful and the monarchy a little less powerful. Thomas Paine will argue in 1776 that that is a farce, that it is a farce, any idea that the parliament is really a check on the king, because the lords receive their grants from the king. And the king can create lordships or peers, and he can remove peers. So the idea that the House of Lords would in any way truly be a check on the monarch, he says, is ridiculous. And then he says, let's examine the House of Commons. He says the idea that the Commons would be a check is also ridiculous. He says when we look at the way people are elected to the Commons. And one of the examples he gives is that there are whole towns that have no representation, like I believe in 1776, perhaps Manchester and Birmingham still do not have a direct representative in the House of Commons. Yet there are these little boroughs that consist of maybe a little farm with a few chickens and pigs and sheep and a few people who live on the farm, that a wealthy peer will then, become a resident of that little township, and voila, will become the member of parliament. I think if any of you watched Poldark, any Poldark fans? I love Poldark. Isn't there a guy on Poldark who gets like elected to the House from some like ridiculous little farming village? The guy who's like, I forgot his name. He's like nouveau riche, the really bad guy who's like a new young banker, and he's all invested in the East India Company, and he's a major villain in the Poldark series. So I think he becomes a member of parliament that way. So Thomas Paine really laughs about that. And he said, as long as there is a monarch, and a monarch can give and remove grants of various types, that there really is no check and balance on the monarch. So Thomas Paine will argue that in Common Sense that is a farce. And some of us here in the colonies in 1765 believe that as well, and have argued that there really is no check and balance in England. But remember, we are rather autonomous here in the colonies, being ruled by our own colonial governments as guaranteed us by our colonial charters. Each one of our colonies has a unique government and a unique set of courts that we administer mostly ourselves. We have a governor appointed by the crown, but our colonial governments are run by ourselves. So we are used to a more direct representation. And as long as we say, England maintains or minds their own business, or I believe they have a phrase for it, which they call salutary neglect. In other words, the crown just lets us do our own thing. The crown just leaves us to our own devices to govern ourselves because they don't want to get involved. We have prospered. And so until now, we really haven't had a reason to question whether the parliament has a check on the king, because really they have not interfered with us until now. So some of that will change as a result of the Stamp Act, the imposition of the Stamp Act. Oh, there's a Blackadder fan. I love Blackadder. And for those of you who are Blackadder fans, there is an episode where they get a little farming village to elect the fool Baldric into the parliament. Sorry. It's a wonderful episode about the fallacy that the House of Commons really represents the people of England, portraying them all as idiots, with a way only Mr. Rowan Atkinson can do. And I'm a big fan, of the Blackadder series. George III. I don't believe George III was having health issues in 1765. I believe they started after the Revolutionary War. Remember, in 1765, I think he's only about 25 years old, right? He attained the crown in 1760 or 61, and he was only 19 or 20 at that time. So he's still a very young man at the time of the Stamp Act. If someone knows otherwise, please feel free to correct me, because sometimes I have to, look up these dates. I can't remember them all. Good job. So you're all laughing over there. I do very highly recommend Blackadder for those of you who really want a hilarious take on English history, especially Blackadder II and Blackadder III, which take place during the reign of Elizabeth I, and then Blackadder III, which is the 18th century. There's a lot of really good, funny stuff in there, with the great Hugh Laurie as the idiot Prince Regent. He's wonderful. Yes, George Warlegan. Yes, that's the Poldark guy. Yes, the nouveau riche, right? He once was kind of a regular guy and has formed an investment company and has invested in all of these, today we would call them derivative instruments based on the East India Company. And those are all going to go really bad. Can you say mortgage-backed securities in 1775? So some of these things play out over and over again. I love Poldark. Do you love do you love that woman's gorgeous red hair? Is that so beautiful? Oh, maybe Mrs. Q. Maybe Mrs. Q should have a red wig. Maybe Mrs. Q ought to have a red wig. What do people think? Do people think Mrs. Q ought to have a red wig? I'm getting thumbs up. Yes. Am I an unusually well-educated lady in my time? Yes, I am. Although there are many of us, and that is due mainly to the radicalness of our fathers. A number of us ladies have had fathers who thought their daughters ought to be educated as well as their sons. In my case, there were only 2 daughters in my family, and we were both educated. So we are somewhat unusually educated. Another was Mercy Otis, later to be Mercy Otis Warren, who was educated alongside all of her brothers. So there are a number of us throughout the colonies. Did I ever tell you who my girlhood teacher was? I should say my sister and I. Our girlhood teacher was the very eccentric Mr. Ichabod Crane. Mr. Crane was hired, of course, I grew up in the Hudson Valley, not far from Tarrytown, as you may know, was hired by my father to teach us. And one of Mr. Crane's favorite ways to have us practice our reading was to take us to the cemetery and have us read the tombstones. And in his way, he said this was a way of killing 2 birds with 1 stone, because not only would we practice our reading, but we would learn the genealogy of our town by reading the gravestones. We would learn the history and genealogy of our town. So Mr. Crane would often take us and have us practice our reading lessons on nice days in the graveyard. He also had a number of very eccentric and clever sayings because, my sister and I were often unruly girls, and one of the things he would say was young ladies, please put on your thinking caps. So every week when I put on my cap for you, I like to think of it as my thinking cap, which helps me think better as we have our discussions. He also would say, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, young ladies. So he had a number of clever sayings, and I think that you know that my friend Washington Irving later will claim that Mr. Ichabod Crane claimed to have been chased one night by the ghost of a headless Hessian riding a horse. I'll tell you, when Mr. Irving told my sister that, my sister sat down and wrote me a letter almost immediately and had one of her servants bring it to me right there the same day. And although we are many miles apart, we had a simultaneous good laugh over our old Mr. Ichabod Crane, who seemed to have finally completely lost his mind. But I have fond girlhood memories of Mr. Crane, who taught us to read and taught us our geometry and taught us our numbers, although my father really taught me my numbers and having taught me to run his business. But it was Mr. Crane who gave us our early education and made us read some of the most horrible things to read. But we did have good fun reading Greek mythology and learning to write in Greek, Greek fashion. So it was some of it was quite fun. Someone here says a girl and I were in the graveyard yesterday. Well, I shall not ask why or what you were doing there. We will maintain our dignity here on Live with Mrs. Q and not discuss such things. What else do we have? Where do you find Blackadder? It must be streaming somewhere. If someone knows if someone has recently watched Blackadder, send me a little message, let me know where you watched it. I would guess it might be on Amazon Prime or Hulu, or it must be on some service. There are 5 seasons of it, but Blackadder the Second and Blackadder the Third, if you're interested in English history of this time. The woman who played Queen Elizabeth was wonderful, right? Miranda Richardson, a wonderful comedian. She was great. And her nursey, I'm having all these great memories of Blackadder. You must watch it. Mrs. Q will be much funnier if you watch Blackadder, I think. Let's see. Someone says it's out on disc. Oh, someone tells me they were driving all the way up Broadway and made it as far as Rensselaer County. Is that in a carriage? And how many days did that take, sir? Or was it in a type of new modern horseless carriage? And in that case, I think it may take just a few hours. Oh, someone really likes Blackadder the First. That's a little bit earlier in time for me, but that is good also. It's out on disc now. Who's Queen? Queen Elizabeth I was played by a British comedian actress named Miranda Richardson, and she was wonderful as the Queen. Just wonderful, right? Off with his head, off with his head. just putting everybody in the Tower of London and cutting off their heads. It's great Blackadder. Someone says it is on Prime Video, Netflix, YouTube, and Google Play. So you have many options for seeing Blackadder. So thank you all for joining me this evening in my home. And I hope you will take some time to learn some more about the Stamp Act of 1765, the Non-Importation, Non-Exportation Agreement, and why it is so important in American history, and find a fun way to teach your children and your grandchildren, because I don't know if they still learn about it in school. So thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you next week on Mrs. Q Live, and I hope I see a whole lot of you this coming Tuesday for an in-depth talk on the Quartering Act, the second big mistake. Did England learn from the Stamp Act? No, they passed the Quartering Act, and we'll talk about that on Tuesday next. So thank you all.